Wyoming Territory, July 1883. Just past sundown the wind carried dust like old ghosts across the empty plain when Orin Vance spotted something strange near the split-rail fence that lined the far edge of the abandoned Frazier Ranch. He reined in his gelding, eyes narrowing. Something pale was tangled against the wooden posts. A person, not moving. Orin kicked his boots from the stirrups and hit the ground hard, his spurs clinking as he ran. The woman was slumped to her knees, arms chained behind her to the fence, wrists rubbed raw. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her hair a curtain of dark blonde, tangled and dusty. He dropped beside her, checking her pulse with shaking fingers. Her skin was warm. She was alive. "Miss," he said low, trying not to startle her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open. Blue, clear, and full of something he could only call fire. "Water," she rasped. He pulled his canteen and held it to her lips. She drank with trembling gulps, her throat working. "I am going to get you out of these," he said, already pulling a small folding blade from his belt. "I am not going to hurt you." She watched him, not afraid, just exhausted. "I know," she whispered. He paused. That voice soft, certain, like rain on dry ground. He did not realize he had stopped breathing until he heard his own shaky exhale. 2 minutes later, the chain came loose and he caught her as she sagged forward. She was light, too light. He lifted her gently and carried her to his horse. "I will take you to my cabin," he said. "It is not far." She nodded faintly, pressing her face to his chest. "Thank you." They rode slow under the bruised sky. Orin kept one arm around her waist, feeling each shallow breath. He had no idea who she was, but he knew this much someone had meant for her to die out there. The cabin sat tucked against a hill, half a mile from the river. He built it himself, years ago after the war and after too much loss. It was the only place that ever felt quiet enough to stay. He carried her inside, laid her carefully on the cot, and lit the lantern. "My name is Orin Vance," he said. "You are safe now." She turned her head, lashes heavy. "Liliah, Liliah," he repeated like a prayer spoken for the first time. "Who did this to you?" Her eyes closed. "I do not know their names, just their voices." "All right," he said softly. "You do not have to talk. Just rest." He washed her wrists, wrapped them with torn linen, and gave her more water. She did not say much after that, just watched him with those sharp, aching eyes until sleep took her. Orin sat by the window most of the night, rifle across his lap. That image of her chained, helpless, alone kept flashing behind his eyes. Something in him had cracked wide open the moment she spoke. He had not felt anything for anyone in years. But Liliah had said one word, "thank you," and it had slid into the hollow in his chest like it had been waiting there all along. The next morning she was sitting up, watching the sun rise through the window. "You should be resting," he said, setting a bowl of beans and bread beside her. "I have rested enough," she said, voice steadier now. "You saved my life." He shook his head. "I just found you." "No," she said, looking at him fully. "You stayed." They sat in silence after that, comfortable, steady. She ate slow, and he watched the way her hands still trembled but her spine stayed straight. "Do you have family?" he asked gently. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded. "Same here." She looked around. "You live out here alone?" "After my brother died, yes. Army took him." "Took a lot of things." Something flickered in her expression. "You ever miss people?" "Every day," he said simply. She reached across the table, fingers brushing his knuckles. "Me too." He did not move his hand, just let her touch stay there, real and warm. Later, while she rested, he rode back to the fence. The chain was still there. Whoever left her had not come back, but he saw tracks. Wagon wheels heading south. When he returned, she was sitting outside in his old coat, watching the wind stir the grass. "I want to stay," she said before he could speak. "Just for a little while," he nodded. "Stay as long as you like." A week passed. Liliah helped patch the roof, picked herbs near the stream, and even fixed his torn shirt with stitches neat as lace. She moved quiet, but her presence filled the space like sunlight. One evening, while they were cleaning fish by the riverbank, she looked at him and asked, "Why did you help me?" Orin set down the knife. "Because I could not leave you like that." No one should ever be left like that. She looked at him for a long moment. I think you saved more than just my life, he swallowed. You gave something back too. What did I give? She asked softly. He turned to her. Hope. She leaned toward him, slow but sure, and he met her halfway. Their first kiss was quiet, like everything between them real, certain, and full of something deeper than either could name. That night, he lit a second lantern in the cabin for the first time in years. One on each side of the bed. And when Liliah reached for his hand beneath the quilt, Orin held on like he had been waiting his whole life. Liliah stood at the edge of the pasture, sleeves rolled up, her bare forearms streaked with dust. The wind tugged at her skirt, and her eyes tracked the slow movement of the cattle grazing near the cottonwoods. Orin was a few yards away, hammering in a fresh fence post, the sound measured and clean. She liked watching him work. There was steadiness in the way he moved, like he understood the land's rhythm and answered it without needing to speak. She hadn't said anything about the dreams. Not yet. They came sometimes before dawn, brittle and sharp, but she never cried out. Instead, she'd slip out of the cabin, wrap herself in Orin's coat, and walk until the weight in her chest loosened. This morning, she'd gone as far as the creek bend before she could breathe easy again. Orin glanced up and caught her looking. You planning to supervise me all afternoon? He asked, brushing his hands on his trousers. I was considering it, she said, folding her arms. You're not bad to look at, he chuckled, the sound low and rare. You thinking about staying through winter? She hesitated, then stepped closer. Would that be all right? His face didn't change much, but something settled in his shoulders. It'd be more than all right. She nodded once, then crouched to pick up the coil of wire beside him. I can help. You don't need to, he said, watching her grip the spool. I want to. They worked side by side until the sun leaned westward, her hands learning the rhythm of the wire and his watching to make sure she didn't catch herself on the barbs. By late afternoon, they had closed the last gap in the fence, and Orin leaned back against a post, wiping his brow with his sleeve. I never asked, she said, sitting in the grass beside him. What did you do before all this? He took a long breath. Drove cattle down from Montana. Before that, rode with the 1st Colorado during the war. Saw too much, lost too much. Did you ever think about leaving the territory? Once. Got as far as Kansas City, crowded me in too tight. I came back. She plucked a stalk of grass, twisting it between her fingers. I used to think I'd see the ocean. Where were you headed? Didn't know, just away. I kept moving until I couldn't. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It just sat there like a third presence, easy and unhurried. The light shifted, turning the grass gold. I found this in the drawer by the hearth, she said, pulling a folded scrap of paper from her pocket. It yours? He took it, eyes scanning the faded pencil lines. My brother's. He used to draw maps. This one's of the river valley south of here. He had a good hand. Orin nodded. He was always better with lines than words. Liliah rested her head on her knees. You have any of his other things? A few letters. A harmonica. I don't play it much. You could. He looked over at her, the way her hair caught the light and the way she didn't flinch from the past his or hers. I might, he said. If you'd want to hear. I would. They walked back to the cabin as the sun dipped behind the hills. She cooked while he washed up at the pump. Later, they sat on the porch, her feet tucked beneath her, his boots propped on the rail. He held the harmonica in both hands, turning it over like it might answer something. I don't know any songs start to finish, he said. Play what you remember. He did, haltingly at first, then smoother, a tune rising out of memory and dusk. She closed her eyes and let it settle over her. When he finished, she opened her eyes and reached for his hand, folding her fingers around his. Thank you, she said. For what? For letting me stay. For not asking more than I can give, not yet. You give more than you know, he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm not afraid here. He kissed the top of her head. Neither am I. The lantern inside flickered warm through the window pane, and the night stretched easy around them. There were no more fences to mend that day, no ghosts that needed chasing. Just one man, one woman, and a porch made wide enough for two. A cold front settled in before the end of August. It swept down from the bighorns, bringing a sharpness to the nights that clung to the bone. Orin brought in the rest of the firewood while Liliah packed wild rose hips into muslin pouches and hung them near the hearth to dry. She moved with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands nimble and sure. Orin returned from the woodshed with a fresh armload and paused in the doorway, watching the way her fingers worked the twine. He didn't speak until she looked up. "You ever done trapping?" he asked. "Some," she said. "Mostly birds, snares, and spring poles. I've got an old line I haven't checked since spring. Thought we might run it tomorrow, see what's still out there." She tied the last pouch, brushed her palms on her skirt. "I'd like that." They rose early the next morning, jackets pulled close, breath fogging in the clear morning air. The trail led west along the ridge, rough with shale and the scent of pine thick in the shadows. Liliah carried a canvas sack. Orin brought his rifle slung low across his back. They didn't speak much, only when necessary. She asked about a type of lichen growing near the rocks. He pointed out a set of tracks, too large for rabbit, too narrow for deer. By midday, they'd found two sprung traps, one empty, the other holding a half-rotted carcass they buried beneath loose stones. At the third, they found a live catch, a lean marmot still breathing. Liliah knelt beside it, examining the creature with a furrowed brow. "Broke its leg," she said. "But it's not festering yet. You want to keep it?" "No," she said. "Let's end it clean." He drew his knife and did so without pause. She closed her eyes as it died, not in fear but in respect. They buried that one too, and she pressed a small stone atop the mound before standing. "You were raised with a sense for living things," he said. "I was taught to leave them better than I found them, or not touch them at all," he nodded. "That's a way I can understand." They made camp near the last trap site, a small clearing surrounded by wind-warped evergreens. Orin built the fire while Liliah boiled water for a poultice she was steeping from bark she'd gathered along the trail. "You used to travel with someone," he said after a while, not a question. She stirred the pot once, twice. "A woman, older, not kin. She took me in after I left the river towns." "What happened to her?" "Fever last spring. We were 2 days from Bisbee. She never made it." He didn't offer comfort. She hadn't asked for any. Instead, he handed her a tin cup of broth when the brew was done, and she drank slowly, shoulders relaxing as the heat settled deep. That night on the bedrolls, she curled beside him without needing to be asked. He drew the blanket over them both and rested his hand lightly against her ribs. "I never thought I'd come to want someone again," he said into the dark. "I never thought anyone would see me without flinching," she whispered. "I don't flinch." "I know." Wind rustled the trees, steady and smooth. She pressed her forehead to his throat, and he tilted his chin to let her in closer. The next morning, frost rimmed the grass in white lace, but Liliah's hands were warm when she reached for his. They shared a strip of smoked meat and a biscuit hard enough to crack a tooth, laughing softly when she tried to soften it in her tea and nearly dropped the whole thing in. On the way back to the cabin, they took a detour by a shallow gulch where wild plum trees grew in sparse clusters. She climbed one with a practiced ease and tossed down the ripest fruit while he caught them in his hat. "We could make preserves," she said, eyes bright. "Only if you do the boiling. Last time I tried, the roof smelled like burned sugar for a month." She grinned, not a small one, not guarded. Her whole face lit, and he felt something shift low in his chest, like roots breaking new ground. They returned just before dusk, arms full of branches and fruit. Inside the cabin, she set to cutting plums while Orin built up the fire, glancing over now and again to watch her move around the kitchen like she'd always belonged there. Later, when the jars were lined in rows to cool, she turned to him and said, "This is the first place I've slept 2 nights in a row without listening for footsteps. You'll never need to hear." She reached for him, no hesitation, and he met her halfway. No words passed, only the brush of her lips against his, slow and certain, and the quiet sound of breath shared between them. They moved together with the ease of people who had carried too much alone, and now, at last, found someone willing to shoulder half. When the lantern burned low and the night pressed close, they held each other not in desperation, but in peace. Outside, the wind shifted south, carrying the scent of rain. Inside, their hands wove together like threads pulled tight and neither let go. The first snow came early that year. Not enough to stay, but enough to ghost across the prairie in thin white veils, caught in the sagebrush and the gaps between fence posts. Orin stood at the edge of the barn roof, hammer in hand, fitting the last of the new shingles, while Liliah laid kindling in the stove inside, careful not to let the fire catch too fast. She'd learned the draft of the chimney ran stronger in wind like this too much flame, and the whole cabin might fill with smoke. By the time he came in, shaking frost from his hair, the stew was simmering and the windows fogged. He shed his coat, hanging it near the door, and crossed to the basin to wash the grit from his hands. "You ever do any hunting with your brother?" Liliah asked, wiping her palms on her apron. "Mostly deer, sometimes elk," Orin replied, reaching for the towel. He was the better shot. "Took me a whole winter to admit it." She smiled into the pot. "You think you could teach me?" He turned, watching her face. "I could try. You want to learn?" "I don't want to be helpless again," she said, quiet but firm. He didn't press. "We'll start with the rifle." "When the weather clears." That night, they sat by the hearth with their chairs pulled close, a small tin of dried beans between them. She showed him how to sort them by size and shape, saying it helped stretch the better ones for cooking. He didn't see the difference, but her hands moved with purpose, and he liked the way her brows knit when she focused. "You ever think about building on to the cabin?" she asked after a while. "Thought about it last spring," Orin said. "Wasn't much reason to then." She nodded once, setting a pale, misshapen bean aside. "There's a dry patch on the south side." "Plenty of room." He looked at her, not just at her face, but at the way her body leaned toward his, how her shoulder brushed his now and then when she reached for another handful. It stirred something steady inside him. "You thinking we might need more space?" he asked. "I'm thinking we're not going anywhere," she answered. The next morning, she rose before the sun and slipped out with the rifle balanced over one shoulder. Orin found her an hour later, kneeling beside a stump at the tree line, lining up a shot on a row of bottles he'd placed for her. "I didn't want to wait," she said, not looking away from the sight. "Didn't figure you would." She missed the first two, but on the third shot the bottle shattered clean. She lowered the rifle and sat back on her heels, breathing hard. "Felt different that time," she said. "You stopped thinking and just listened," Orin said. "That's the trick." They kept at it until the clouds thickened and the wind shifted again. Liliah rubbed her shoulder as they walked back, the rifle slung across her back. "Too light," Orin said. "I'll cut a thicker stock, something to fit your frame better." "You do that. I want you to have what fits," he said. A week passed, and the snow held off. They spent the days hauling stones from the far field, clearing space where she'd traced a chalk outline for the new room. At night, she read aloud from an old ledger book she'd found in the root cellar, its pages filled with notes on weather, planting, and trade. Orin listened, sometimes carving, sometimes just watching her lips form each word. One evening, she paused mid-sentence and closed the book. "If I asked you something, would you tell me true?" she asked. "I don't know any other way," he said. "If I said I wanted to marry you, would that scare you off?" He didn't answer right away. He rose, crossed to the shelf, and pulled down a cedar box she hadn't seen before. He opened it slow, revealing a silver ring, plainly made but polished smooth by time. "My brother gave me this before he left, told me to use it if I ever found something worth keeping." She reached for it, brushing the edge with her thumb. "Did you ever think you would? I do now." He slid it onto her hand. It fit without effort. They didn't celebrate loud. She boiled coffee and he added a second log to the fire. When they lay down that night, it wasn't different than the nights before except that now, their hands found each other under the quilt and stayed there without needing to search. In the days that followed, she began stitching a curtain for the new window he'd framed. He taught her how to set a beam true, and she showed him how to preserve eggs in ash. They didn't talk about what had come before, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't need retelling. One morning, while he was out stacking the last of the hay, she stood at the doorway, the ring catching the early light. She watched him work, the way he paused to stretch his back, the way he checked the edges of the stack for wind gaps. She called out and he turned, lifting a hand in greeting. "I was thinking," she said, voice clear in the crisp air, "we ought to plant something next spring." He walked toward her, each step solid. "What did you have in mind?" "Whatever takes root," she said, and when he reached her, he bent and kissed her once, slow and certain. She leaned into it, not because she was seeking something, but because she'd already found it. Neither of them said anything more that day. They didn't need to. The wind had shifted for good. The first frost held through October, crisping the creek's edge and tinting the cottonwoods a brittle gold. By then, the addition to the cabin stood complete, simple, square and sturdy, with hand-planed walls and a narrow window that faced the hills. Orin had finished the floorboards himself, and Liliah had sewn a rag rug from cuttings in her chest. It smelled faintly of cedar and chalk dust. One morning she woke to find him already dressed, standing barefoot on the porch steps with steam rising from his coffee. She pulled on her shawl and stepped out beside him. "There's smoke," he said, motioning beyond the ridge. She shaded her eyes. A thin gray column rose where there hadn't been anything the day before. Not a house fire, it held steady. Controlled. "Someone's moved in," she said. "North side of the old Beckett claim, I'd guess. Could be trappers," she added, voice even. "Could be someone worse." They saddled the horses and rode the fence-a-line, checking for new crossings or signs of cut wire. Orin's revolver sat higher on his hip than usual. Liliah didn't ask why. They saw the strangers camp by late afternoon, a canvas tent tucked beneath a slope, with a lean horse tied to a post and a woman kneeling by a cook fire. She looked up when they approached, hand resting on the axe beside her. "We're neighbors," Orin called, stopping well short. The woman stood slowly. Her coat hung too loose, her boots were worn through at the toe. "Didn't know this land was taken," she said. "It isn't, not formally," Liliah answered, "but it's watched." The woman studied them both, then nodded once. "Just passing through." "Lost my husband outside Fort Laramie, been heading west ever since." Liliah dismounted and stepped forward, careful but without fear. "You got food?" "Some beans, not much else." "We've got plenty, come by tomorrow." "We'll send you off with something more than that." The woman hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Her eyes softened just a little. "Name's Ruth, Liliah," she said. "That's Orin." When they turned for home, Orin didn't speak until they reached the rise above the cabin. "You didn't have to offer her anything, neither did you," he glanced at her. "You think she'll come? She needs to. I think she knows it." They baked that night cornbread and biscuits, a jar of plum preserves sealed with wax. Liliah wrapped it all in a flour sack and left it by the door. Ruth arrived just past dawn the next day, her shoulders stiff until she stepped inside and caught the scent of warm bread. She sat with them a while, long enough to eat and take a second cup of coffee. Liliah asked no questions. Orin offered no judgment. When Ruth left with the sack tied to her saddle, she looked back once, just long enough to tip her chin. "She'll keep moving," Liliah said after the door shut. "She'll remember this place." November brought hard wind and the first deep snow. They kept the barn stocked, hauled water in pails when the pump froze, and took turns tending the fire through the coldest nights. Liliah started mapping the land around them, not in ink, but in memory, where the deer passed, where the ground held firm, where the ice cracked sooner than it should. One night, as she mended a torn sleeve, Orin leaned in the doorway and watched her work. "I've been thinking," he said, voice quiet. She looked up, needle paused. "About what?" "About raising a few more head, maybe 2 milk cows, a couple of pigs. Something to make this place more than just shelter." She smiled. "You want a farm, I want a home, one with you in it." She set the fabric in her lap. "Then we'll need a coop." He stepped forward, kneeling beside her. "I want to make something that lasts, Liliah." Something we can hand down. She reached for his face, thumb brushing the line of his cheek. So do I. Their wedding took place 2 days after the thaw. No preacher, no paper. Just the two of them, hands clasped beneath the cottonwood by the creek, speaking vows they wrote in silence the night before. He promised to build a life with her, not just walls and roofs, but days filled with steadiness and care. She promised to stay rooted, no matter the season, and to never flinch when the past came knocking. Afterward, they shared bread and coffee, and Orin tucked a sprig of dried rosemary in her braid, saying it reminded him of the scent she carried when she first came through his door. Spring came slow but sure. Green pushed through the frostbitten ground, and the plum trees bloomed in thin white bursts. They planted rows of potatoes, beans, and squash, and built a henhouse from leftover planks. Orin crafted a cradle from pine boards, though neither of them spoke aloud the hopes that had begun to bloom alongside the seedlings. One morning, Liliah pressed his hand to her belly, and he felt the slow heartbeat beneath her skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They sat on the porch that night, her head on his shoulder, his arm curled around her. The sky burned soft with stars, and the wind no longer carried the edge of winter. It carried the scent of earth, of growing things, of all the days they would have together. Orin turned to her, brushing his lips against her temple. "You ready?" he asked. She nodded, eyes closed, smile quiet. "I've never been more." And so they stayed, through the summers and winters that followed, through harvests and lean seasons, through the laughter of their children and the long, slow turning of the land. The house grew with them. The love they built rooted deep and strong, outlasting every storm. They had not come looking for this life, but they built it anyway with hands scarred by the past and hearts stitched together by mercy. And it lasted.